He came home the same way every night, off the number 203 bus, a short walk down a quiet street in the San Fernando district of Buenos Aires, lunchbox in hand, work boots still carrying the grime from the factory floor. He wore the same oil-stained overalls. He kept his head down. He nodded to neighbors when he had to, never more than that. His name, according to his papers, was Ricardo Klement, a German immigrant, quiet, unremarkable, a man who worked the assembly line at the Mercedes-Benz plant, paid his rent on time, and minded his business. The neighbors found nothing unusual about him. There was nothing to find. He had spent 15 years making sure of that. What they didn't know, what no one in that neighborhood knew, was that Ricardo Klement did not exist. The man walking down that street was Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, the bureaucrat who had turned the systematic murder of millions into a logistics problem and solved it. The man who had organized the deportation of Jews from across occupied Europe into the death camps of Poland, who had sent over 400,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz in a matter of months, who had attended the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, received his instructions, and spent the next 3 years making sure the machinery of genocide ran without interruption. For 15 years, he had been hiding in plain sight, and in the spring of 1960, he was about to be found. This documentary examines how a government made a decision, not just to capture a man, but to redefine what justice looks like when the law has already failed. It does not glorify what happened. It does not condemn the choice as simple. It asks the harder question: when a man responsible for crimes of this magnitude has slipped through every legal system designed to catch him, what does a state do? What should it do? That question doesn't have a clean answer. It never did. But the operation mounted by Israeli intelligence in 1960 forced the world to confront it, and the consequences reshaped international law, intelligence doctrine, and the moral framework of how nations pursue accountability for mass atrocity. This is the story of Operation Finale. To understand what the operation meant, you have to understand who Eichmann was. Not the monster of imagination, but the specific, mundane kind of evil he actually represented. He was born in 1906 in Solingen, Germany. A Protestant family, middle class. Nothing about his early life suggested what was coming. He was an average student. He dropped out of vocational school. He drifted through a series of low-level sales jobs, petroleum products, heating systems. He had no particular ideology, no burning obsessions. He joined the Nazi Party in 1932, not because he was a fanatic, because a friend recruited him, because the movement offered structure and purpose to young men who had neither. He joined the SS through the same social channel, personal connection, not conviction. And inside that organization, he found something that suited him almost immediately. He was good at systems, not violence, not intimidation. Systems, logistics. The cold architecture of moving large numbers of people from one place to another with maximum efficiency and minimum disruption. He understood bureaucratic processes the way some men understand engines, intuitively, completely. He rose through the ranks not by cruelty, but by competence. He learned to speak some Hebrew and Yiddish in the late 1930s, not out of sympathy, but because understanding the Jewish community he was tasked with managing made him more effective. He became the Reich's internal expert on what they called, quote, zero. He attended conferences, he wrote memos, he coordinated with local governments across occupied Europe. By 1942, he held the title of head of the Jewish Affairs section within the Gestapo's Reich Security Main Office. He reported directly to Reinhard Heydrich and Heinrich Himmler. At the Wannsee Conference, a 90-minute meeting outside Berlin on January 20th, 1942, the final solution was formalized. 11 million Jews across Nazi-occupied Europe were to be deported and murdered. Eichmann was in the room. He took notes. He left with a clear operational mandate. What followed was murder at industrial scale. Eichmann organized deportations from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, France, the Netherlands, Greece, Hungary. He negotiated with foreign governments. He resolved scheduling conflicts. He allocated rail cars. He managed the flow of human beings into the death camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, with the detached precision of a supply chain manager. When local officials resisted, he escalated. When logistics broke down, he fixed them. When Hungary's government in 1944 initially balked at cooperating, he personally supervised the operation, and in less than 8 weeks, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were dead. Survivors who encountered him later described someone calm, methodical, and wholly indifferent to the human cost of his work. Not raging, not gleeful, just focused, professional, and efficient. That portrait matters, because it explains how he was able to disappear afterward. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, Eichmann was in Austria, watching the regime he had served disintegrate around him. He understood immediately what his name on an Allied war crimes list would mean. He moved fast. He burned his documents, shed his SS uniform, and took on the identity of a low-ranking soldier named Adolf Eichmann. He spent months hiding in the Bavarian mountains, then moved to northern Germany, where he worked as a laborer and avoided Allied investigators. But his name kept surfacing. Survivors and captured Nazi officials mentioned him repeatedly in witness testimony. By 1946, prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials were identifying Eichmann as a central figure in the Holocaust. The Allies were looking for him. He understood that Europe was no longer safe. He made contact with Odessa, a clandestine network of former SS officers that had been quietly operating since the war's end. The network ran safe houses, forged documents, and organized escape routes to South America, where right-wing governments were willing to accept European immigrants without rigorous scrutiny. It was one of the most efficient post-war escape systems ever assembled. It had already moved hundreds of Nazi war criminals out of reach. In 1950, Eichmann received false papers identifying him as Ricardo Klement, a displaced refugee. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which was issuing travel documents for displaced persons with minimal verification at the time, provided him with paperwork. He traveled through Austria into Italy, spent time at a monastery near Genoa that had become a regular transit point for fleeing Nazis, and boarded a ship to Buenos Aires. He arrived in July 1950. Argentina under Juan Perón had become one of the most hospitable environments in the world for former Nazi officials. The government's policy of welcoming European immigrants, combined with weak extradition agreements and a large German expatriate community, made it functionally a sanctuary. Eichmann wasn't alone. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz physician responsible for lethal medical experiments, was already there. Others had come before and after. The country had, whether intentionally or not, become a refuge for men trying to disappear. Eichmann built his new life with the same methodical care he had once applied to organizing genocide. He found work at a water company, then a laundry, then the Mercedes-Benz plant. He rented a small house in San Fernando, a working-class suburb on the edge of Buenos Aires. He brought over his wife, Vera, and their 3 sons. In 1952, a 4th son was born. They named him Ricardo, after the alias. He attended German social clubs where former Nazis occasionally gathered. He kept his false identity intact. He was, to everyone around him, just another European immigrant grinding out a modest life in a new country. And then, in the late 1950s, the first crack appeared. It started not in Israel, but in Germany, with a prosecutor named Fritz Bauer. Bauer was a Jewish jurist who had made the pursuit of Nazi war criminals his life's mission. He was also a man with a very clear-eyed view of the West German justice system. Many former Nazi officials had quietly reintegrated into post-war German institutions, the courts, the civil service, law enforcement. Bauer knew that routing sensitive intelligence through official German channels was not just inefficient, it was dangerous. The wrong information, reaching the wrong person, could get Eichmann a warning and enough time to run. Bauer had received a tip from Argentina. A German immigrant there had a daughter who was romantically involved with a young man who claimed his father was Adolf Eichmann. The young man, Klaus Eichmann, it would later be confirmed, apparently harbored some pride in his father's wartime role. The informant passed along an address, a house on Garibaldi Street in Buenos Aires. Bauer made a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential in post-war history. He didn't go to German authorities, he went to the Mossad. The Israeli intelligence service had been hunting Nazi war criminals since the state's founding in 1948. For many of its officers, a significant number of whom were Holocaust survivors themselves, this was not simply professional duty. It was personal. The pursuit of men like Eichmann carried a weight that no bureaucratic mandate could fully explain. The case was assigned to Isser Harel, the director of the Mossad. Harel was known for his operational intensity, his instinct for detail, and his willingness to accept significant risk in the pursuit of what he considered necessary outcomes. He authorized a preliminary investigation. In early 1960, a Mossad agent traveled to Buenos Aires under a cover identity, located the house on Garibaldi Street, and began surveillance. He photographed the man who lived there. He documented his daily routine. What he found was a portrait of deliberate anonymity. Every day, the same schedule. Leave the house at the same time. Walk to the bus stop. Return in the evening. Minimal public exposure. Never lingering. Always scanning his surroundings. The tradecraft of a man who had spent 15 years worried about exactly this. But the photographs were not conclusive. 15 years had passed since the war. Eichmann was older, thinner, wearing glasses. Facial recognition technology did not exist. Identifying a man who had successfully concealed himself for a decade and a half required more than photographs. It required behavioral confirmation. Harel reviewed what had been gathered and reached a preliminary judgment. The man on Garibaldi Street fit Eichmann's description. The location matched the informant's tip, but more evidence was needed. He ordered expanded surveillance, focused now on the family. Investigators established that the woman living in the house was Vera Liebel, Eichmann's wife, under her original name. They confirmed that one of the sons was named Ricardo, matching the alias. The pieces were assembling. But Harel wanted certainty before committing to an operation of this magnitude. It came through patience. Surveillance teams noted that the family held a birthday celebration on March 21st. That date corresponded to Adolf Eichmann's actual birthday. It did not correspond to the birthday listed in Ricardo Klement's forged documents. The discrepancy was small. But in intelligence work, small discrepancies are the whole game. Harel had his confirmation. The man on Garibaldi Street was Adolf Eichmann. Now came the decision that would define the operation and generate controversy for decades. Israel had options. The most conventional path was diplomatic. Request extradition through official channels. But the obstacles were significant. Argentina had no extradition treaty with Israel. The Argentine legal system operated slowly. And most critically, any formal request would inevitably leak. Eichmann had survived this long because he was careful. Given any warning at all, he would run, and this time he would likely disappear permanently. The alternative was direct action. Israeli agents would capture Eichmann on Argentine soil, remove him from the country by covert means, and deliver him to stand trial in Jerusalem. The operation would violate Argentine sovereignty, It would breach international law. It would risk a serious diplomatic crisis. If it failed, if agents were caught, or if Eichmann were killed during the capture, the fallout would be severe. But if it succeeded, there was certainty. The man who had organized the Holocaust would face justice in the country born from its survivors. Harel presented both options to Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion approved the operation without extended deliberation. Eichmann would be taken. The mission was given the operational codename Finale. Some of the agents also called it Operation Garibaldi, for the street where their target lived. Planning began immediately. The team Harel assembled was drawn from the Mossad's most experienced field personnel, specialists in surveillance, interrogation, document forgery, and extraction logistics. A physician was attached to the team. His role was to manage Eichmann during transport, keeping him sedated enough to prevent resistance without rendering him incapacitated in a way that would attract attention. The operatives traveled to Argentina separately over several weeks, arriving under different cover identities: tourists, businessmen, students. A safe house was established, a rented villa on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. From there, the team ran final surveillance on Eichmann's movements with near-clinical precision. They timed his commute. They measured the interval between his exit from the bus and his arrival at the house. They mapped the route, identified points where police patrols were rare, and selected a capture location. The plan was direct. A team would intercept Eichmann during his walk from the bus stop to his front door, force him into a waiting vehicle, and transport him to the safe house. There, his identity would be definitively confirmed before extraction from the country began. The most complex element of the entire plan was not the capture, it was getting him out. Moving a kidnapped former Nazi war criminal across international borders without documentation required a solution that was both logistically airtight and completely invisible to Argentine authorities. The solution came from an unlikely but perfectly timed opportunity. Israel was sending an official delegation to Argentina for the country's 150th Independence Day celebrations. An El Al flight was scheduled to deliver the delegation and return to Tel Aviv on May 20th. If the Mossad could get Eichmann to the airport and onto that plane, disguised as an El Al crew member traveling under a medical cover story, he could leave the country under diplomatic protection, with no Argentine official likely to question why an Israeli flight attendant appeared to be somewhat unwell. The date was set, May 11th, 1960, 9 days before the extraction flight. On the evening of May 11th, the capture team took their positions along Garibaldi Street. A car sat idling near the bus stop. 3 men waited. At approximately 8 minutes past 8 in the evening, Eichmann stepped off the bus. The street was quiet. The lighting was poor. He walked with his head down, lunchbox in hand, the same walk, the same posture, the same practiced invisibility he had maintained for 15 years. He never saw them coming. As he passed the parked car, 3 men moved. One came from behind, forearm across the throat. A second grabbed his legs. A third pulled the car door open. Eichmann tried to shout. A hand closed over his mouth. In less than 20 seconds, he was inside the vehicle. The door closed. The car accelerated. The street remained empty. No witnesses. No alarm. Adolf Eichmann, the man who had organized the deportation of millions, had just been taken off a sidewalk in Argentina like an ordinary criminal. The operation's first phase was complete, but the harder work was about to begin. At the safe house, the team went to work. Eichmann was brought inside and placed on a bed. His pockets were emptied. His glasses were removed. He was physically restrained but not harmed. Then the questions began, in German. Who are you? What is your real name? For the first hours, he held his cover. Ricardo Klement. He didn't know what they wanted. He insisted on his false identity with the mechanical precision of a man who had rehearsed it thousands of times. But the interrogators were not asking questions they didn't already know the answers to. They laid out photographs from wartime, images of Eichmann in SS uniform. They cited specific operational details from the Holocaust that only Eichmann would have known. They pressed on dates, names, organizational structures. Slowly, across the course of the night, the architecture of the alias began to fracture. His answers became less immediate, then more evasive. His hands, which had been still, began to tremble. His voice, which had been controlled, started to waver. Harrell himself conducted part of the interrogation, and in the early hours of May 12th, the man on the bed stopped pretending. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 0, underscore, underscore. He did not ask why they had come for him. He already knew. The confirmation passed through the team quietly, not with celebration, but with the particular stillness of people who understand that what they have just accomplished is significant and that the harder half of the mission still lies ahead. What came next was 9 days of controlled tension, unlike anything most of the operatives had experienced. Holding Eichmann in a safe house in Buenos Aires, while Argentine authorities had no knowledge of any of this, while his family would eventually notice he hadn't come home, required a level of operational discipline that bordered on the extreme. The team maintained rotating watches. Eichmann was kept sedated during periods when alertness posed a risk, but allowed periods of consciousness so that the sedation didn't accumulate to dangerous medical levels. The physician monitored him continuously. He was fed. He was allowed supervised bathroom use. He was, in every practical sense, being kept alive and stable for a journey he had not agreed to take. During the days of confinement, Eichmann was also compliant in a way that unsettled several members of the team. He ate. He slept. He showed no remorse, no agitation, no existential distress. He seemed to understand his situation with a clarity that had apparently brought him to something approaching acceptance. One operative later described it in terms that would become famous in discussions of this operation. Eichmann was not a monster in the way people imagined monsters to be. He was disturbingly ordinary. A middle-aged man in a room, eating his meals, adjusting to captivity with the same methodical calm he had once brought to the logistics of mass murder. The horror wasn't in his ferocity. It was in its absence. That observation of the mundane face of extreme evil would become one of the most discussed legacies of the entire Eichmann affair, though its full implications would not be articulated publicly until Hannah Arendt's reporting on the trial the following year. On May 20th, the extraction window arrived. The team dressed Eichmann in an El Al crew uniform. The physician calibrated a dose of sedatives carefully tuned to a narrow target. Enough to keep him calm and cooperative, not enough to make him appear incapacitated. Too little, and he might resist or call out at the airport. Too much, and he'd appear obviously impaired to any official who looked closely. The physician found the balance. Eichmann walked to the car with support. He passed through airport security without incident. Argentine officials saw what they were meant to see: an El Al crew member being helped along by colleagues, apparently unwell, being returned home for medical care. He was seated in the rear of the aircraft. The doors closed. The engines started. The plane lifted off Argentine soil at approximately midnight and turned east over the Atlantic toward Israel. For the first time in 15 years, Adolf Eichmann had no more escape routes left. The plane crossed the Atlantic in silence. Eichmann sat in the rear of the aircraft, sedated and still, surrounded by men who had spent weeks hunting him. The South American continent receded behind them. The ocean stretched dark and featureless in every direction. The world's most wanted war criminal was airborne, heading toward a reckoning that most people had long since stopped believing was possible. Isar Harel reportedly sat apart from the rest of the team during the flight. He didn't celebrate. According to those present, he was already thinking about what came next. The capture was done. The harder question, what it meant and what it would cost, was just beginning. When the El Al flight landed in Israel on May 22nd, Eichmann was taken into secure custody outside Tel Aviv. His presence was kept secret for several days, while Ben-Gurion decided how to announce it, with full awareness of what was at stake, not just legally, but historically. On May 23rd, Ben-Gurion stood before the Knesset. Adolf Eichmann had been found. He was in Israeli custody. He would be tried for crimes against the Jewish people and crimes against humanity. The announcement landed differently depending on where you heard it. In Israel, it produced something close to collective silence, the particular stillness of a people who had spent 15 years wondering whether the men responsible for the Holocaust would ever face justice. Survivors wept. For many, this was the first moment since 1945 that accountability felt real. In Argentina, the reaction was entirely different. Buenos Aires lodged a formal protest within days. The grievance was legitimate. Israeli agents had entered Argentina without authorization, conducted a covert operation on Argentine soil, and abducted a resident of the country. The sovereignty violation was unambiguous. Argentina brought the matter to the UN Security Council. The debate that followed forced the international community to answer a question no one had properly addressed since Nuremberg. What does a state do when the legal system cannot reach someone responsible for crimes of this scale? Argentina's argument was legally straightforward. Return Eichmann. Pursue extradition through proper channels, however imperfect. Israel's counter-argument was more complicated and more honest. They acknowledged the violation. They did not deny it, but they argued that no extradition mechanism then existing would have reliably delivered Eichmann for trial, and that a man who had organized the murder of 6 million Jews had a moral obligation to face judgment from the state built by survivors of that murder. The Security Council resolution that emerged was a measured rebuke. It acknowledged the sovereignty violation. It declared such acts potentially dangerous to international peace. It requested appropriate reparation. It did not demand Eichmann's return. That distinction was everything. The international community had implicitly drawn a line. The method was unacceptable in principle. The outcome would stand. Israel issued a formal apology to Argentina. Both governments released a carefully worded communiqué expressing regret without admitting legal wrongdoing. The diplomatic crisis closed. Eichmann remained in Israeli custody. The trial opened on April 11, 1961, in a specially constructed courtroom in Jerusalem. It was televised, one of the first major legal proceedings broadcast live to a global audience. Hannah Arendt covered it for The New Yorker. Journalists from dozens of countries filed daily dispatches. Over 4 months, the prosecution presented documentary evidence of overwhelming depth. Survivors testified. Documents bearing Eichmann's signature were entered into the record. The chain of command was established with precision. His orders, his authorizations, his personal interventions when local officials resisted. Eichmann sat in a bulletproof glass booth throughout. Dark suit. Taking notes. An expression observers described as controlled and largely devoid of emotion. His defense rested on a single framework. He had followed orders. He had been a bureaucrat executing policy, not an architect designing it. A small gear in a vast machine. The evidence dismantled it. Document after document showed Eichmann not merely complying with orders, but exceeding them, taking initiative, solving problems that could have been left to stall, personally traveling to Hungary in 1944 when local officials resisted deportations. He had treated the organization of genocide as a professional challenge and met it with sustained managerial energy. The verdict came on December 11, 1961. Guilty on all counts. The sentence: death by hanging. The only death sentence ever carried out by the State of Israel. On the night of May 31, 1962, Eichmann was hanged at Ramla prison. His body was cremated, his ashes scattered beyond Israeli territorial waters. No grave, no marker, nothing that could become a site of pilgrimage. His last words were a statement of loyalty. Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. I had to obey the rules of war and my flag. No remorse. To the end, the same detachment. The trial's most lasting intellectual contribution came not from the verdict, but from the observation it generated. Hannah Arendt had expected a fanatic. She found a bureaucrat. She expected ideology to be the engine of his crimes. She found efficiency. Her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, introduced the phrase ___, quote, _0, ___. The argument that the most destructive forms of evil are not always driven by passionate hatred, but by thoughtlessness, by people who execute instructions without moral reflection, who treat human beings as units in a process, who substitute procedural compliance for ethical judgment. The phrase generated controversy then, and still does. Some argued Arendt had understated Eichmann's actual anti-Semitism. Others felt she had been manipulated by a courtroom performance carefully calibrated to minimize his culpability. The debate continues. But the broader argument that ordinary institutions and ordinary people are capable of facilitating extraordinary evil when structured to avoid moral accountability proved to be one of the most consequential ideas produced by any trial in the 20th century. For the Mossad, the institutional legacy was significant in a different register. The operation had required nearly a year from the initial tip to the Buenos Aires extraction. It had been built entirely on human intelligence, source cultivation, long-term surveillance, identity verification, with no satellites, no digital intercepts, no electronic surveillance. Eichmann's identity had been confirmed by months of patient observation. A birthday celebrated on the wrong date, the name of a child, the rhythm of a man walking to a bus stop. Harrell later wrote that the operation represented intelligence work at its most serious. Not technology, but analysis. Not speed, but persistence. Not the dramatic single moment, but the accumulated weight of small, accurate observations over time. The operation also established a precedent within the Mossad that shaped the organization's identity for decades. Pursuing Nazi war criminals became something closer to a defining institutional commitment, because Operation Finale had demonstrated it was achievable. That lesson was not lost on others still hiding under false names across the world. Josef Mengele, living in Argentina when Eichmann was taken, fled almost immediately upon hearing the news. He spent the remaining 19 years of his life moving between South American countries in permanent paranoia, never settling, always expecting the team that came for Eichmann to come for him next. He died in Brazil in 1979, having drowned while swimming, never captured, never tried. But the fear itself was a form of consequence. Operation Finale had permanently broken the assumption that time and distance guaranteed safety. The trial's legal legacy extended far beyond the specific case. The Eichmann proceedings reinforced the doctrine of universal jurisdiction, the principle that some crimes are so severe that any state has the authority to prosecute their perpetrators, regardless of where the crimes occurred. The Israeli Supreme Court's ruling that the illegal means of Eichmann's capture did not invalidate the court's jurisdiction entered international jurisprudence and has been cited in extradition disputes for decades since. There is a direct line between the Jerusalem proceedings and the eventual establishment of the International Criminal Court in 1998. The idea that certain crimes are the business of the entire international community, that borders cannot permanently shield their perpetrators, that time does not extinguish accountability. That framework was built, in significant part, on the legal and moral architecture demonstrated at Jerusalem in 1961. Ben-Gurion's decision to choose trial over assassination was the load-bearing choice that made all of this possible. He could have ordered Eichmann killed in Buenos Aires. The argument for it, cleaner, faster, no diplomatic exposure, was not without logic. He chose trial instead, because trial was the part that would last. The capture was an operation. The trial was an archive. Harel was explicit about this afterward. The trial, he wrote, was as important as the capture. Perhaps more important. It created a public, permanent, legally verified record of what had happened, told through the voices of survivors, backed by documentary evidence, adjudicated by due process, and preserved in a form that could not be dismissed or denied. 65 years later, the questions the operation raised remain open. Legal scholars still debate whether the Israeli precedent created a dangerous template, whether granting any state the implicit license to violate sovereignty in pursuit of its own definition of justice ultimately weakens the international legal order for everyone. The concern is not hypothetical. Extraterritorial rendition has been invoked by various governments since 1960, not always in pursuit of individuals whose crimes approached anything like the Holocaust. Others argue that a legal framework which cannot reach the organizers of genocide is a framework that has already failed at its most fundamental level, and that the Holocaust was categorically different, not just in scale, but in kind, from the crimes that ordinary legal structures were designed to address. Both arguments contain real weight. Neither fully resolves the other. What remains, examined without reverence or dismissal, is the gap between legal order and moral necessity, and the difficulty of navigating that gap without creating new problems while solving old ones. The house on Garibaldi Street no longer exists. The neighborhood has changed. The physical markers of Eichmann's 15 years of hiding have been largely erased by time, but the record has not been erased. It exists in the trial transcripts, thousands of pages of testimony, evidence, and judicial deliberation. It exists in the survivor accounts formally entered into the legal record of a sovereign state. It exists in the Mossad's operational files, still classified, somewhere in an archive outside Tel Aviv. Eichmann had bet on the world forgetting. He had counted on time to degrade the institutional will to pursue him. He assumed that chaos, complexity, distance, and simple human exhaustion would eventually make him safe. He was wrong on every count. What broke his calculation was not technology. It was the refusal, institutional, personal, moral, of a specific set of people to allow the passage of time to become an alibi. The machinery of forgetting is powerful. It has bureaucratic inertia and human exhaustion working in its favor. The Eichmann operation stands as evidence that the machinery can be interrupted, but only by people who decide, and keep deciding, that it will be. A man who organized genocide lived for 15 years as a factory worker in Buenos Aires. He was found, captured in 20 seconds on a quiet street, flown out of the country, tried in a court of law, convicted on the evidence, and executed. The system worked, eventually, imperfectly, controversially, in a way that created as many legal questions as it answered. And yet, the question Harel posed at the end of his memoir remains. When the institutions designed to deliver justice are inadequate to the scale of the crime, when the legal machinery of civilized nations cannot reach the men responsible for the worst acts in recorded history, what obligation remains? To whom does it fall? Adolf Eichmann died at the end of a rope in a prison outside Tel Aviv. The men who put him there believed they had no other choice. Whether that belief was correct, and whether the precedent it set has made the world more just or simply more dangerous, is a question that every generation inheriting those consequences will have to answer for itself.